Oh, you're well. It's not my house. So. You can sit back on their seat too.
Call Rukmini.
You are live.
So we're going to read from. Actually, I'm going to read from the Mahabharata, and we were just having a very interesting, lively discussion. So about Krishna West, and now we're going to read from Mahabharata. I'm at the home of Bharata and Rukmini in Gainesville, Florida, near the Bhaktivedanta Institute House. So we're going to choose some chapters from Mahabharata. By the way, it's also Christmas, so Merry Christmas to everyone.
How large is the online audience right now?
I don't know, but it's probably growing. Yeah, I'm. We're on Yard Stream, whatever that is, and then people can tune in from around the world. So if you want to, I'm willing to sell some commercial space on this program if anyone wants to advertise something or. So if everyone's settled, we can begin. Javi,
I'm here.
ready? We start.
Yes.
Okay, it just in the first volume of what I call Great Bharata, which is translating Maha, so people can understand Great Bharata, I have identified, at least for my narration of it, the central figure is actually a lady named Satyavati. And Satyavati is a pivotal character in the Mahabharata. Let me explain this first. The Mahabharata itself is so big that, there we go, even 5,000 years ago, there was a need for abridged versions. Actually, just like we have so many abridged versions of the Mahabharata, so that process of abridging the text or making a shorter version actually began with Vyasa himself. Vyasa himself did the first condensed Mahabharata because even 5,000 years ago, it was a big book. And the Mahabharata also says that because it's so large and basically tells the whole history of the universe and creation, so the Mahabharata says that different sages begin their narration at different points. And one of the primary points, one of the main places where many sages, even thousands of years ago, began their narration was the story of Vasu. And that's where I began. And I mean, everything is related in the Mahabharata. Everything is connected to everything else. But ultimately, the main story, the central story, which directly leads to Krishna coming to this world and the Pandavas coming to this world, that main story actually begins with a king named Vasu. And so this may not come out in the Indian comic book, so I'm going to explain it. Vasu actually became the emperor of the world, but he was not based in Hastinapur. We've often heard that whoever was the king in Hastinapur was the king of kings or emperor. That was true a lot of the time, but it wasn't always the case. So 5,000 years ago, Indra himself arranged to shift the imperial power away from Hastinapur to a kingdom south of there called Shady. Of course, later Shishupal would take birth there. So why did he do that? Why did Indra do that? Why was power shifted away from Hastinapur? First of all, you have to understand that, I mean, it's all interconnected. For example, the Mahabharata actually begins in the 8th canto of the Bhagavatam, where the asuras and devas are churning the ocean of milk, and then the asuras have evil intent. So Vishnu comes as Mohini and says, "Hey, big boys, what do you got in that container?" And so then Mohini steals the nectar, and then a war breaks out. And then Vishnu leaves, and a war breaks out between the asuras and the devas. And the devas are winning, but then the asuras resort to what I call dark magic. They have like all kinds of magical apparitions. They don't fight fairly, and the devas, demigods, are being killed. And so then Vishnu comes from his white island, Shweta Dvipa, which is the abode of Vishnu in this world. Literally means white island. It's a white island in a white ocean, in an ocean of milk. And so, I mean, you have to picture this, where Vishnu just kind of, they're looking over toward Shweta Dvip, toward this island, and then Vishnu on Garuda just sort of comes up in the air and then just comes toward them. Now, what's interesting is that when Vishnu approaches this battle scene, he hasn't yet raised a weapon. Vishnu did not attack the asuras. He's still, in a sense, coming as a peacemaker. And actually, the asuras strike first. And the first asura who just, without provocation, wants to kill Vishnu, and Garuda, by the way, also, his name is Kala Nemi, which is, Kala in Sanskrit also sometimes comes to mean death. It means time. Like Krishna says, "Time I am, destroyer of the world." And so Kala means time, or like time that destroys everything. And Nemi is the rim of a wheel. So it's sort of like this wheel of time that's destroying everything. That's Kala Nemi. So he takes this trident and he hurls it at Vishnu. And Vishnu, very adroitly, just catches it in the air. I mean, he's hurled it like this superhuman speed and force. And Vishnu catches it, throws it back at Kala Nemi so hard that it actually goes through his body. It goes through he's on this celestial lion. It goes through the lion body, killing both of them, just, goes into the earth. So at that point, it's kind of like, okay, now it's war. And then these different asuras come, not an army, but the asuras. And of course, Vishnu with his chakra, he just, a little off the top. Vishnu just starts decapitating these asuras. And then finally it's a rout, and the devas win. So now, and the reason I'm mentioning all this is because there's a whole story behind the Mahabharata which has been lost. Madhvacharya wrote a whole book on Mahabharata, in which he says, among other things, that the text is thoroughly corrupted over time, that most of the original verses were lost. This is Madhvacharya, it's not me. It's not my latest and greatest deviation. This is actually Madhvacharya. So it's just like in Star Wars, for example, if any of you know about Star Wars. There's a central story. The central story is an evil empire. Empires are always evil in Hollywood, regardless of history. But anyway, so an evil empire has taken over the galaxy, and now the pious Democrats, the democratic people, are trying to fight against them. That's a central story. So whatever goes on in Star Wars, like this person falls in love with that person, or that person has to escape this asteroid or that planet, it's all built around this central story. It's all built around a central story. Whereas the Mahabharata, in what Madhvacharya calls its highly corrupted form, has severe narrative amnesia. In other words, it introduces this story and then promptly forgets all about it. And so it's kind of chaotic, which is, I think, the reason why it's never really worked for non-Hindus, or let's say like devotees. So anyway, there is a central story, and the Encyclopedia Britannica estimates that the central story of the Mahabharata constitutes, around 20% of the whole book, and 80% is stories that aren't directly relevant. not directly. So anyway, and so when Prabhupada says in the beginning of the Krishna book, once when the world was overburdened by the unnecessary defense forces of asuras disguised as demons, he doesn't mean that they were asuras disguised as demons because kings should be devotees and they weren't devotees. He means they were actually extraterrestrial invaders. The earth was actually invaded by these people. And so to put it in context, it was a typical insurgency. Insurgency, by definition, it's a military action by people who do not constitute the central government, aren't the official government, but they're insurgents. They actually try to take over a government. And so what insurgents always do, if you just know about history, is that they go to some remote place where they can gather their forces, train, and then march on the capital. And so when the asuras were defeated by Vishnu the Devas, they went to a remote place, like say on Earth. For example, there's an insurgency, there has been one forever in Colombia, called FARC. And so what did they do? They went into the jungle, the Amazon jungle in the southern part of the country. In Chechnya, the insurgents went into the mountains. In North Africa, the insurgents in Sudan went into the desert. So that's what insurgents do. So the plan was that these asuras, and the leader, one of the leaders of the asuras was Viprachiti, and then Kalanemi, who was killed by Vishnu. And so they decided they would go to a remote planet, out of the way, take over that planet, turn it into a type of Death Star, and then attack the three worlds. And so the remote planet they chose was Earth. And that's actually what's going on in the Mahabharata. That's actually the story. And there's another reason why they chose Earth, and that is because Earth had recently witnessed another avatar, which was Parashuram. Parashuram killed all the warriors, and then you had all these young Kshatriya ladies with no one to marry. And so an arrangement was made that the most pure, they would approach the purest Brahmins who would give them sons and daughters and reconstitute the royal order. But the result of that, and it's all interconnected, but it's sort of had to put the pieces together, you know, as a historian. Let me just get rid of that. So in a sense, that was a problem because all the new kings, the new generation of kings, they were sons of Brahmins. And because they were so pious, there was nothing bad on earth. I mean, the Mahabharata emphasizes that it was like the Satya Yuga had come again. No one lied, no one stole, no one committed violence. So for the kings, there was nothing to do. And therefore, the Kuru king, the traditional imperial capital of Hastinapur, it's King Pratipa, what's he doing? He's sitting on the bank of the Ganges doing yoga. He's meditating for the good of the world because there's nothing else to do. And this is in the direct aftermath of Parashuram. So therefore, the Asuras think the earth is out of the way and it is incredibly naive right now. And so another strategy on the part of the Asuras, again, this is all there, but you have to put the pieces together. Another strategy was that they realized that Dharma is a force in the universe. That whole thing with Star Wars, the Force, may the Force be with you, and the dark side of the Force, that actually comes from the Mahabharata. Because when Buddhism migrated east from India, it brought all this culture with them. So Dharma is not simply a rule in a book. Dharma is a power in the universe. It's a cosmic power. It's the force. And so, for example, the Mahabharata says things like, Dharma rakshito rakshati. When Dharma is protected, it protects. Dharma hingsito hingsiti. When Dharma is injured, it injures. So Dharma is this force in the universe. And the Asuras, in order to avoid diminishing their power, they decide that they will inherit the earth. They will take birth in leading royal families and simply inherit kingdoms. Another thing they had, did you ever wonder why, for example, Kamsa, which comes a few generations later, why Kamsa, when he discovers that the demigods are taking birth through their expansions on earth, he orders the killing of Brahmins. Why order the killing of Brahmins? So I had to figure that out, I mean, Krishna's mercy. And so I really studied this. Why kill the Brahmins? Because in fact, we know that all the Asuras had Brahmins. They all had their renta pundits, because Jarasandha had so many Brahmins, all the Asuras had their Brahmins for hire. So what does it mean to kill the Brahmins? And so to do that, to figure this out, I went to chapter 16 of the Bhagavad Gita, which actually explains the psychology and philosophy of Asuras. And so we find there is very interesting. The Asuras have a very modern worldview. They have sort of a modern scientific worldview, which in some ways is very similar to Karma Mimamsa philosophy. Because if you I'll go like halfway back to the Asuras through Karma Mimamsa and show you how they actually have this Asura philosophy. I took a course in Karma Mimamsa actually at Harvard. I took a whole course and we read one of their main books. So the basic idea of Karma Mimamsa, which is very modern and sort of atheistic, is that the universe is ultimately a big cosmic mechanism. It's a big mechanism, very modern, right? And it just so happens that somehow or other, and they don't really care very much why or how, the universe comes with an instruction manual. And the instruction manual is called the Veda. Because this is going on before the Veda was divided. So if you say the Vedas, it's anachronistic. The Veda is the instruction manual for the universe. And it just exists. It's just like, why do mountains exist? Why do galaxies exist? They just exist. So from the Karma Mimamsa point of view, why does the Veda exist? Who wrote it? It's a Paurushe, which they interpret to mean has no author. It just exists. It's the code. So if you understand the Veda, you crack the cosmic code. And so from the Asura point of view, when you do a Vedic sacrifice, it's not that Vishnu is empowering the Brahmins, it's exactly the opposite. Because they understand that Vedic sacrifices produce power. It's just like, think of a nuclear, generator, or some kind of electrical plant. The Veda is simply a mechanism that generates power. And by the mantras, because mantras are vibrations. And ultimately everything is vibration. So therefore, by vibrations, you can actually channel that power anywhere you want. It's just like if you have a nuclear reactor and you generate all this power, you can send the power anywhere you want, to your country, another country, turn the lights on, make bombs. It's just power. It's raw power. And so the Asura worldview is that Vishnu exists. However, Vishnu is empowered by this mechanism. And therefore, if you specifically kill the Vaishnava Brahmins, you cut off Vishnu's source of power. And Vishnu is weakened. And he can't regenerate his power. It's like killing the Brahmins is sort of like Vishnu's kryptonite. And so Rukmini. Come on in, Rukmini. So that is the Asura. I mean, it's right there in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 16, all this. There is no absolute truth. There is no God in control. Everything is mechanism. So therefore, they thought another idea. So then you could say, why, for example, the Mahabharata also states that wild animals at that time were killing Brahmins in the forest, which had never happened before. Why? Because the Asuras, and this is in the Mahabharata, were taking birth as ferocious animals, carnivorous beasts, and they were killing Brahmanas. Why? Because there's no bad karma. So they were actually, in other words, because they knew ultimately they're going to have to spend a lot of their karma reserves to take over the universe. Therefore, not to waste that power, they tried to violate dharma as little as possible. So they inherited great kingdoms, and they let Asuras in the form of wild beasts kill Brahmins. And this is the situation on earth. So if you wonder, like, why did Bhumi go to Brahma? This is what's going on. And Vasu, who was performing a sacrifice to go to Indraloka, and Indra came down and said, don't do that. Don't go to Indraloka, stay on earth. And so first of all, why was Vasu, the great Vasu, is very important, is he's called Uparichara Vasu, which I swear to God literally means upwardly mobile Vasu. I'll explain why. So so Indra came to him. First of all, again, studying this as a historian or trying to be a scholar, it's the first question that came to me, well, that's very strange. Indra doesn't come to humans. Indra doesn't come to humans. And if there's some, like king or Brahmana that's getting too much power and wants to go to Indraloka, Indra just calls in an apsara and just takes out a contract on that person. The apsara goes down and fall down. But why does Indra come personally? And then Indra tells him, because Vasu agrees to give up his aspirations to go to Indraloka. And so therefore Indra says, and this is very explicit in the Mahabharata and said repeatedly in verses that no one actually ever paid attention to, Indra actually says that I will make you the emperor. You will be king of kings, Raja Raja. You'll be the king of kings. You'll be Samraj, the emperor of the world. And you're going to rule out of Chedi. He picks the kingdom of Chedi, which is sort of maybe a little bit south west of Jhansi, where Prabhupada spent time, which is like right down from Delhi. So anyway, I'm skipping. There's hundreds of amazing details that I just don't have time for. And so that's the story. So now Satyavati, here's another point. Satyavati, according to, well, I'll go into this. There in the Mahabharata, sometimes you come across sections which are, to me, obviously like fables. I don't mean Krishna's a fable. I don't mean the soul is a fable, but there are fables which are just almost like carnivalesque, to use one word. And so I'll give you an example of that. And just so you know the full extent of my depravity, how I'm handling this. First of all, I asked myself, wait a second. Does Vasu just walk into Chedi and say, hi, everybody, I'm your new king? How did he become the king? And then it said but somehow he becomes the king of Chedi. It's not explained how. And then he marries this girl called Girika. So how is Girika born? Girika is born because there's a river that goes through the capital of Chedi. It's called Shuktimati, which is also the name of the capital, which literally means Pearl River. So the kingdom of Chedi, the capital is on Pearl River. And so there's this mountain or a big hill right out, near the river called Kolahala, which means Mount Uproar or Mount Commotion. So this hill is conscious, and it is lusting after the river, and the hill falls on the river and rapes it and impregnates it. So I thought, okay, yeah, that happens all the time. A hill falls in a river, rapes it, impregnates it, and a human girl comes out. So then that girl marries Vasu, and they're the king and queen of Chedi. And then the king and the queen, she's young, she's young, she's not that old. And so it's just come to the time they're going to consummate their marriage and try to have a child. And both of them are really eager to consummate their marriage. They're attracted to each other. And so right at that time, the forefathers come to the king and tell him, you have to go out to the forest right now and, kill some animals for a sacrifice to us. And so it's like I started to think, what would a real person do? A real king would have probably said to them, I am right on this. I'm going to leave in 1 hour and go and, go to your wife and give her a child and then leave. But he just goes. But he can't stop thinking of his wife. And he's out in the forest. He can't stop thinking of his wife, and he passes semen. He's so attracted to his wife. So then he gets he has like this messenger falcon, and he he takes his semen, puts it in a little leaf package, gives it to the bird, and presumably his wife knows how to artificially inseminate herself. But anyway, so this leaf package, and then he sends it, and on the way, other birds of prey see this bird, think it's meat, attack it. The semen falls into the river, is swallowed by a fish who becomes impregnated. So hills can impregnate rivers, and human seed can impregnate fish. But anyway, whatever. So, so then the fisherman chops open the fish, and you think, frankly, if you're chopping open a fish, I mean, you probably would kill the little babies, but somehow he chops open the fish and doesn't kill the babies. He's like, oh my God, human twins, a boy and a girl, takes them to the king, and the king says, oh, that's my boy. So how he knew that, we don't know. But that's my boy. And the girl obviously is his girl, and that's his only daughter, the king and queen, their only daughter, but she like has sort of this fish smell. So he says to the fisherman, you can have the girl. So now when I read that, something apart from the unusual forms of impregnating female creatures, I began to think this. What really got to me, what really made me think something's wrong here. And like I said, Madhvacharya says there's corruption all over the Mahabharata. What is that? Loving fathers and mothers don't give away their daughters because they have some kind of odor. People don't do that. So what's really happening? And so this is how, so I'll tell you now, but I didn't reject it. I didn't say this is all just made up. And again, when we get to Krishna Leela and the Pandavas, this stuff kind of doesn't come up that much. So I'm not going to produce Mahabharata, which will finally get me expelled from ISKCON. So, but I thought that this stuff in the Mahabharata is telling us something. I think it's kind of what survived of an original history. And so I'll just tell you how I see this. And again, I'm not going to do a Mahabharata where nothing spiritual happens, no souls, no powers. No, not at all. But some things are just too much. So I think, first of all, that as far as a hill raping a river, I thought, what would happen in the world as we know it that would be like that? And I thought, well, a landslide. And if the girl, who I think was actually the queen of Shady, a young girl who had become the queen because her parents were gone, and she actually fell into the river, and that Vasu saved her. But then, as far and I don't think, and so I think they just had children. Because by the time these twins, boy and girl, come out of the fish, they already have two sons. Brihadratha is the oldest, who's the father of Jarasandha, by the way. So it's all interconnected. And so I believe twins were born. By the way, and this, it's all connected. When you start to do the geography, study the kinship relations. So for example, Satyavati's twin brother is named Matsya. And what's significant about Matsya, her twin brother, is that he's going to create a new kingdom. He founds a new kingdom. And that new kingdom is called Matsya Desh or Virat, and that's where the Pandavas chose to hide, in the kingdom of their great uncle's twin sister, Satyavati, a twin brother of Satyavati. So anyway, so why would loving parents, noble loving parents, send away their only daughter? And not only send her away, but send her to a low-class, vulgar place like a fishing village. And so to me, the answer was obvious. It was to save her life. Because again, if you bring back the central story and don't totally forget it, which the text we have today does, it just completely forgets the main story. And if it's really, there's a battle brewing between the Suras and the Asuras for control of the universe, and if Satyavati is actually going to bring to the world the first avatar who will begin the counterinsurgency against the Asuras, then her life would be in danger. And therefore, to save Satyavati's life, she had to be hidden. And so she was sent to a place where no one would ever suspect a girl to be the emperor's daughter. So, and then it all starts to make sense. Like, for example, the fact that the emperor's daughter ends up marrying the new emperor when her parents pass away, the new emperor being Shantanu of Hastinapur, when imperial power is transferred back to Hastinapur. And as far as why it was transferred, it had to be transferred. It had to be, the power had to go back to Hastinapur for obvious reasons. Because when Vasu passed away or retired, his first son would take charge of what had become an empire. And it's stated that way. It's an empire, which actually has 6 different kingdoms with the center in Chedi. But because Brihadratha would become the new emperor, his son would inherit the throne. So in 2 generations, the emperor of the world would be Jarasandha. Jarasandha is actually the main asura. We tend to think of Kamsa. Kamsa was not on the level of Jarasandha. We focus on Kamsa because we focus on Vrindavan. But actually, it's stated even in the Bhagavatam that Kamsa was under the protection of Jarasandha. Kamsa married the 2 daughters of Jarasandha. And by the way, we've already met these 2 people because in the 8th canto of the Bhagavatam, in that fight between the Suras and Asuras, the first impetuous demon that tried to kill Vishnu, Kalanemi, he took birth as Kamsa. And so that's when Narada tells Kamsa that actually the Devas are already here and Vishnu killed you in your last life. That was Kalanemi. And then Viprachitti, who was one of the main Asura leaders, he takes birth as Jarasandha. So it's all connected. It's all connected. It's all one story. And so, I mean, there's hundreds of details, but I'm just trying to give you an idea that it's actually just like Star Wars, at least the first 3. The other ones I won't, defend. But if you look at the original Star Wars trilogy, it's all one story. There are subplots, but all the subplots directly feed into the main story. Do we have any more time or not?
Sure.
So I thought I'd read something knowing all that. And it's a very dramatic thing. And this is how I envision it. When Satyavati finds out who she really is. Satyavati in some ways is similar to Karna. Although, thank God, not in all ways. And there's a widespread myth that, poor Karna, which is a complete twisting of the actual Mahabharata story. But anyway, so Satyavati is an emperor's daughter, and she's brilliant, but she grows up in a fishing village, and she doesn't know why she's always frustrated and why she doesn't want to marry a fishing boy. And then at a certain point, it's revealed to her who she really is. Anyway, I have all these stories where she goes to the capital, meets her real parents, and all these things. But so then, I mean, consider Satyavati's, and there's also a very widespread Hindu illusion because, about Satyavati. Satyavati is widely perceived by Hindus as like this ambitious, cunning, ruthless lady that wants the kingdom for her sons against Bhishma, which is not at all in Mahabharata, by the way. It's just a Hindu imagination. If you don't, just look up Satyavati in Wikipedia, written by a Hindu, and see what the Hindu view is of Satyavati. So, so Satyavati, when she marries Shantanu, it's like the daughter of the previous emperor is marrying the new emperor. It's an extremely strategic alliance. I'm not saying that was the only reason they married. I think they were actually in love, but it was extremely strategic. And another question to ask, again, if you're looking at this as a historian, what in the world was Shantanu doing near Satyavati's village? That's hundreds of miles from Hastinapur, and kings don't just go wandering around in other people's forests. Anyway, I explain all these things, like what Shantanu was doing there. But so I'll read a little bit. So Satyavati when she realizes who she really is, she's actually the emperor's daughter. And even when Bhishma is taking her to Hastinapur after they worked out this deal, I think the real villain is the fisherman, the one who, exacted these conditions. But if you think your way through, if you really put yourself there, she's going to Hastinapur, and in a sense, she's being set up for this incredible planetary humiliation. Because it's not mentioned anywhere that Shantanu even knew that Bhishma, or Devavrata as he was called, went to get Satyavati and renounce the throne. Shantanu had never agreed to marry her under these conditions. Because it's mentioned in the Mahabharata that these are all kinds of details that are not noticed. It's mentioned in the Mahabharata that Bhishma was specifically Yuva Raja, the young king, which meant the heir apparent, as opposed to the heir, what's the other one? I forget, but heir apparent means, and that's what Yuva Raja means, presumptive, the heir presumptive. The heir presumptive means someone's next in line to the throne, but it could change, like someone else could show up. But heir apparent means that the person is locked in to the throne by law, dharma, and therefore no matter what, no matter who else shows up, that prince will be the next king. And so Devavrata was the heir apparent, which means that Shantanu himself did not have the power to deny him the throne. So, and by another thing about Devavrata, you have to understand, he was only like 15 years old. 15, we're not talking about a man, he was a boy and didn't know what he was doing. And I think a lot of his behavior afterwards is because he made this decision when he was very young and then had to live with the consequences of it, which are very difficult. And also another thing is, generally in the comic books or the Mahabharata summaries, like the demigods say when he makes his vow, Bhishma, like awesome. But actually that's not what the word means. The word Bhishma comes from the Sanskrit bhi, which is a verb meaning to fear or to endanger, like bhaya, Prabhupada's abhaya, fearless. So therefore Bhishma actually means terrifying or frightening. And so what the demigods, in my view, are actually saying is that this is very frightening what he's done. Why? Because Bhishma is, in the literal sense of the word, the way the rest of the world uses it, a demigod. Like a demigod in the normal use of the word means someone who has one divine or celestial parent and one human parent. So because it's frightening, because as the son of Ganga, the goddess, and the son of Shantanu, he was supposed to protect the earth from the Asuras. But if he gives up the throne, he cannot, on his own volition, protect the world. And actually, there must have been another condition, because first you said, okay, you renounce the throne, and then he had to say that you will never have, your sons will never be the throne. You see, he kept adding on conditions, but that's not enough. Because even if he had renounced the throne, Bhishma's sons could then kill Satyavati's sons or just seize the throne. And so therefore it had to be exacted that your sons will never rule, and to make sure they don't, you can't have sons. But if you think it through logically, again, if you understand what Madhvacharya said, we've got a corrupted text with lots of verses lost. There must have been another condition, because without this other condition, all the first conditions would be useless to the Fisher King. The last condition, which was absolutely required, was that Bhishma would never take up arms except under the command of a sitting Kuru monarch. Because without that condition, for example, Bhishma could just go next door to Panchala, traditional rivals of the Kurus. The Kurus and Panchalas are very much like England and France through history. Sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. And so he could just go to some other, he could go to Panchala, he could go down to the Yadu land, he could go anywhere and offer his services, or just take over a kingdom, create an army, and go attack the Kurus. And therefore the Kurus, Satyavati's sons, could not be safe unless Bhishma renounced the throne, renounced producing sons, and renounced ever fighting except by the order of a Kuru monarch. And it was precisely these conditions that led to the Battle of Kurukshetra. So if you consider that if Bhishma had not made that vow, there would not have been a Battle of Kurukshetra, because he would have been the Kuru king. And the demigods or the devas were only concerned about defeating the asuras, and now the person who could have defeated the asuras had given up his autonomy, given up his power, and therefore they say Bhishma, terrifying. So this is what I'm taking from, very, very close reading of the Sanskrit text. And I accept that. I mean, obviously, a lot of parts of the Mahabharata are real history. And how do we know that? Because we have something to check it against, and that is the Bhagavatam. That's another thing. The Bhagavatam and the Mahabharata often tell the same stories, and so we go with the Bhagavatam. Sometimes the stories are very different. For example, how Parikshit left this world. There's a completely different story where Parikshit's not even a devotee, not courageous, not nothing, in the Mahabharata, but we don't accept that story because Vyasadeva corrected the Mahabharata in producing the Bhagavatam. And so another thing that's different is that, so we have the Bhagavatam, or of course, maybe I'll just end with one more point. So can't get a chance to read because I could go on forever, but there's one thing which has, is there some water?
Yeah.
A point that has endeared me to many ISKCON leaders. I'm joking. And that is the point about Draupadi. And so I'm just going to talk about that for a minute. First of all, so the first point is this about Draupadi. Who among us is willing to go out in the public to educated people and urge them to accept Vedic culture if in Vedic culture a man can gamble away his wife like property, knowing that if he loses the gambling match, she will become a sexual toy of God only knows how many men. But you can do that. That's legal. That's dharma. Actually, it's not. And the authority we have that women are not property and cannot be treated or traded like property, the authority for that is Krishna himself in the Mahabharata. In the story where Subhadra and Arjuna eloped, and by the way, it turns out that some women like Subhadra were expert at driving war chariots. I mean, the role of women was very different than what we may think. For example, the Mahabharata describes among the Pandavas wrestling tournaments, but held among women. Women had wrestling tournaments. And Subhadra was expert at driving a war chariot. Anyway, just a few details. So how can we recommend a Vedic culture where you can gamble your wife? Another point is that in the Mahabharata itself, when the first time that Draupadi saw Krishna after all this horrible gambling match, what did she say to Krishna? She said, when I was in that trouble, why didn't you help me? Now, why would Draupadi say that if Krishna not only helped her, but saved her? And it's a very famous scene where Draupadi says, you didn't come, you didn't help me. Another point, the Bhagavatam, again, Lord Chaitanya certified the Bhagavatam. H.D.Goswami said the Bhagavatam is our highest authority. And the Bhagavatam gives a completely different account of what happened to Draupadi in the gambling hall. Who am I? Just a, cult leader. But the point is, what does the Bhagavatam say about the insult to Draupadi? The Bhagavatam, by the way, which is our ultimate authority, mentions that scene 5 times. 5 times it mentions the insult to Draupadi. And all 5 times it says the offense to Draupadi was touching her hair. So what does that mean? To understand that, you have to see that in this culture, they had this very, very heavy thing that everyone took extremely seriously, a type of symbolic anatomy or anatomic bodily symbolism. I mean, to explain what that means, just consider how our teachings are just permeated by serving the feet, worshiping the feet. Does it mean that a good disciple has to be a pedicurist? No. It's symbolic. To serve the feet means to serve humbly. Bande Guru Sri Charanaravinda. Prabhupada never asked disciples, come and, give me a pedicure, or come and, he asked us to go out and preach, sell his books. But that was serving the feet. So just as the feet are a very powerful symbol in Vedic culture, so is the head. Consider an incident which is in the Bhagavatam, which to modern understanding is absolutely inconceivable. And that is that Ashwatthama killed the 5 sleeping sons of Draupadi. He was arrested by Krishna and Arjuna, dragged, that said Pashuvat, like an animal. They tied him up with ropes and dragged him like an animal back to their military camp. And when they got back there, and this is very interesting to all the wonderfully self-righteous people that haunt the internet in the name of Krishna. Here we have a case where 2 pure devotees, 2 personal associates of Krishna, Bhima and Draupadi, completely disagree on the proper punishment for a horrible abuser. 2 pure devotees completely disagree about this. Bhima, no surprise, kill him. Draupadi says, Muchatam Esha, let him go. Don't make his mother suffer the way I'm suffering. And Krishna's in the middle. So first of all, I think something, people should just try to understand the Bhagavatam. 2 pure devotees, eternal personal associates of Krishna, totally disagree on the proper punishment for a terrible abuser who actually murdered 5 innocent people. And so Krishna is in the middle. He has to somehow satisfy both these pure devotees. Neither Draupadi nor Bhima is accused of being, supporting murder. They just disagree on what to do. So then what Krishna does is he cuts off Ashwatthama's hair with the crown jewel on it. Now, what's interesting is the Bhagavatam then says that is the way you kill a Brahmin, not nadaihika. You don't physically kill him. Now, from our modern culture, this is like absolutely baffling and incomprehensible that someone kills 5 young men in their sleep, which is against all of the warrior code, and the punishment is you give him a funny haircut. The same thing with Rukmi and Krishna. So unless you, I'm glad someone likes this. So unless you understand this, you can't really understand what's going on in this culture. Because ultimately punishment is, for example, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, actually Arjuna says, hey, when you grow up and get rich, remember me, how nice I was to you. So you have to somehow or other understand this culture. It's a very different concept. And yet punishment means how someone suffers. Now, by the way, I personally want to make this extremely clear. I'm not taking any position on the proper punishment for various high-profile people engaged in abuse. I'm absolutely leaving that to the proper authorities, including government agencies outside of ISKCON and all that. I'm not trying to tell everybody what to think about that. I'm simply explaining that Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Mahanubhavasya cha kirtir maranat atirichate. This is Krishna speaking. No, I'm sorry, it's Arjuna. He says that, no, I'm sorry, it's Krishna. It's definitely Krishna. And so what this means is for someone who is Mahanubhava, who's literally had great influence, like a big influencer. I mean, that's actually what it means. But for someone who's had great influence in society, like I think it's translated in the BBT book, like for a great personality or someone who's been honored. Dishonor, akirti. Kirti is the same as kirtan. And so akirti is the opposite, defaming someone rather than glorifying them. And so Krishna says, akirtir maranat, even more than death, atirishate, it is severe. It is worse than death. And so if someone has had a position in the Hare Krishna movement and then been publicly shamed, and you could say, appropriately shamed, but publicly shamed forever, for years all over the world, and Krishna says that is worse than death. And then of course you always get people say this person got off totally free, no punishment. I don't see a whole lot of activity that I think classify as thinking going on. But again, I'm not saying what should be done. I'm not saying what the punishment should be. I'm not meddling in anyone's, everyone come to your own conclusions. I'm just saying though that anyway. So I really mean that sincerely. I mean, whatever judicial authorities decide, that's fine with me. So it's so you think of Ashwatthama. So take the case of Draupadi now. If a proper punishment, according to Krishna, for the murder of 5 innocent persons, innocent according to the Dharma code because they were sleeping, if the murder of 5 young innocent people, if the punishment is to humiliate this person, and it was humiliation, it was such a humiliation that Ashwatthama basically never showed his face in society again. So the punishment really worked. He suffered so much, he basically never showed up again anywhere. And so considering that, how severe that punishment was, now go back to Draupadi and consider how severe it was to grab her hair. In fact, if you want to know what the position of women was in Vedic culture, touching a woman's hair, and the word touch is used, not even grab, sparsha, kacha sparsha. And the Bhagavatam, not the Mahabharata, says, kacha sparsha tayusha, that these people were killed because they touched her hair. The offense for just touching the hair of a respectable lady was death. It was capital punishment. And Draupadi said, so if you want to know what the position of women was. So Draupadi said, she said that because in the Mahabharata, they loosened her hair. She said, all of your wives will loosen their hair at your funerals. And it said that Krishna heard what Draupadi said, and Krishna said, I will personally enforce it. So these people, for touching Draupadi's hair, were executed. So, I mean, the real Vedic culture, you have to study these things and see what's really going on. But getting back to, anyway, so what was actually Vedic culture? As far as gambling, the brothers, I'll just mention this briefly. So you see what I'm doing, according to what Krishna says, I don't believe that in Vedic culture you can gamble people. I don't believe that people are treated as property. They're treated as people. And so in the case of the brothers, when Yudhishthira gambled his brothers, my conviction is that to understand what was going on, you have to understand the nature of feudal law. Because the legal system and the social system described in the Mahabharata is what we would call a feudal society. I'll wait till you do that. So I have to explain a minute about what feudal society was. It wasn't just a bunch of crazy knights in a Monty Python movie running around. It was the actual concept of the you could say feudal sociology was that, first of all, every human being is a servant of God. You could say that's the first point. Every human being is a servant of God. However, human beings serve God within a hierarchical system, so that the peasants, let's say, serve the landowners or the nobles. The nobles serve the priests directly worship God. So it's a sense of everyone serving God within a hierarchical system, which we call, the Varnashram system. So that's what and they have the same Varnas, by the way. The priests were the Brahmins, they had the royals, the Kshatriyas, they had the merchants or the Vaishyas, and they had the peasants. So it was the same Varna system, which Prabhupada said is all over the world. So in that system, let's say, for example, that one noble had an obligation to another. A typical example, let's say in British history, or even in general European history, would be that there was a noble who had his own castle and his own little army. However, he was under the king. And the king was sort of primo inter pares, first among equals. In other words, the king was also a noble. And therefore, if you look at British history, royal history, what you find is that different houses, like the House of Lancaster or this house or that, different noble houses would assume the kingdom. So you had all these nobles. The Magna Carta, that's what the whole Magna Carta was about. Magna, by the way, is from Sanskrit Maha, in case you're interested. The great letter. The whole Magna Carta was to establish this point that the king was not, in a sense, in another category. He was just the first among nobles, which was also the Vedic system. So therefore, among all these royals, among these princes or kings or earls or dukes or whatever, as they had in England, there were obligations. Like, for example, the House of Lancaster, when we had an obligation to serve another royal house in England, which means that if this royal house, is in a war, you have to send troops, you have to fight with them, and so on and so forth. And so therefore, what is negotiable, what you can gamble, what is a liquid instrument, is not the person, but the military obligation. It's just like if let's say I owe you $100, and let's say it's a legal debt. I mean, there are actually legal documents that we've both signed. That debt, that legal debt, is a liquid instrument. You can sell it, you can trade it, you can auction it, you can give it away in charity. It is a liquid instrument. So in the culture of the Mahabharata, military obligations were liquid instruments, and you could gamble them, as opposed to gambling people, which I don't think you can do in civilized societies. So that's what I'm doing. That's when I'm not, watching NFL highlights. That's actually how I. Hey, what's wrong with that? So, any questions on all this? Yes, please.
Can you say what you were going to say about Draupadi when she said to Krishna, "Why did you not
come?"
That point?
Yeah, because if Krishna did come, and it's sort of like like this infinite sari shop. If Krishna had actually come and saved her, why would she say to Krishna, "You didn't come to help me"? And by the way, I mean, it's a great story. Draupadi putting her arms up, when she tried to keep her club. By the way, also we have evidence that women didn't wear saris back then, but that's another point. So, because they wore a top piece and a bottom piece and a belt, which doesn't sound like a sari. So anyway, I mean, it's a great story. I mean, I don't know anyone, including myself, that at some desperate moment hasn't put their arms up, you know, and thought of Draupadi and Krishna, help me, save me. It's a wonderful devotional story, and on some plane, it, you know, it can happen. However, and also if you look at the scene, for example, Draupadi herself in the Mahabharata appealed to all the elders to save her, to stop this nonsense. And what's interesting is, and of course, the one who finally stood up and had some guts and said, this is nonsense, was Vidura. As usual, Vidura is the one who actually spoke the truth. But when Draupadi appealed to Bhishma, what's very interesting is the Bhishma, who's kind of like this classical act-based ethicist, in the sense that there are different theories of ethics. And one theory that Bhishma had, which is, by the way, not the one Krishna had, is that the act itself, like, for example, you don't lie, you don't tell lies, and therefore it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. It doesn't matter. And Krishna himself rejects this idea. That was Bhishma's philosophy, and Krishna rejects it as an ethical philosophy. And he rejects it at Kurukshetra, and Krishna himself tells a story. There was a Brahmana, a sage, a renowned sage, who was very proud of being of answering any question honestly. He's very proud of this. If anyone asked him a question, he'd answer honestly, no matter what the consequences. That's Bhishma. Krishna is telling this story to show Bhishma why your ethical philosophy is the wrong one. Because in this act-based theory of ethics, you disregard the consequences. But in fact, what Krishna teaches in the Mahabharata is that an act includes its consequences. An act includes what it causes in the world. Like if you shoot someone with a gun, you can't say, well, I didn't touch the person. You know, the bullet killed him. You know, go put the bullet in jail. So consequences matter. So there was this sage who was very proud of answering any question truthfully. So one day he was doing his yoga practice, whatever, and these terrified citizens ran through his ashram, pursued by these murderous thieves who wanted to kill them and rob them. You know, because as the pirates used to say, dead men tell no tales. So they hid in the forest around the ashram. And then the killers came and asked the sage, have any people come this way? He had to be honest. Yes. Do you know where they are? Yes. Where are they? Oh, they're over in the forest there. So the sage, these criminals went and killed these innocent people. And what was Krishna's conclusion? Because the sage kept his vow and told the truth, he went to hell. Because the sage kept his vow and Krishna said he not only went to hell, he went to a really bad hell. It's like it was a really bad hell because he told the truth. And so when Draupadi appealed to Bhishma in the Mahabharata, he's not thinking about the moral consequences. Draupadi is not even a human. She's a goddess. She was born out of a fire altar. She's not even a human. I mean, she's this super pure lady. And they're, you know, and they're insulting and offending her in terrible ways. And instead of focusing on that, instead of focusing on Vaishnav aparad or just basic abuse, he's thinking about the technical point. Well, technically, Yudhishthira gambled Draupadi after he gambled himself. So if someone loses himself in a gambling match, does he still have power over his wife to gamble her? Bhishma doesn't say a word about what's really happening, this horrible abuse. He's just thinking technical jurisprudence.
Couldn't it be?
But my point is this. If the story was true, that would mean that since Bhishma was so attentive to the letter of the law, never mind what the law is really, the purpose of the law, then if that story is true, it would mean that technically in Vedic culture, you can gamble a chaste woman knowing that, Duryodhana is not just going to take her himself. He has there's 100 of these guys, brothers. They're all going to have it, take their turn with Draupadi. And perhaps some of their friends like Karna, who wanted Draupadi anyway. So my point is, since Bhisma's whole concern is the technical letter of the law, not the purpose of the law, if this story is authentic, it means that legally, there can be no legal objection to gambling a chaste wife. There can be no legal objection to that. And if you have that, you've got a Vedic culture, which frankly, you can promote it if you want. I'm not going to promote a culture where you can gamble away a chaste wife to be sexually abused by perhaps hundreds of men, and that's legal. But you can't have it both ways.
Couldn't it be, if I may ask?
Sure.
That because your logic is sound, but I've heard Srila Prabhupada countless times recount that story.
However, Prabhupada, but at this one point, you got to take into consideration in our line, in our whole Vaishnav line, the acharyas are not so concerned about pastime details. They're concerned about siddhanta. And therefore, the acharyas never disagree on siddhanta, but disagree all the time on pastime details. And Prabhupada was not a fact checker about Leela details. I'll give you one example. Prabhupada said in the letter to Umapati, which is spelled with W, Wumapati, which is great. He said in the letter to Umapati, and also said in a Bhagavatam purport. So some people say, well, if it's just in a letter, maybe, but if it's in a purport, no. This is in a letter and a Bhagavatam purport, where Prabhupada said that Karna was called Karna because he was born out of Kunti's ear. It's kind of like a sort of Victorian concept of, Karna's birth. Now, and Karna means ear in Sanskrit. So here's the point. No Shastra says that Karna was born from Kunti's ear. No previous Acharya said that Karna was born from Kunti's ear. So there's no Acharya, there's no Shastra, and Prabhupada said Shastra is the final authority. And it's impossible because no one knew that Karna was Kunti's son until the Battle of Kurukshetra. So why would they call him Karna because he was born out of Kunti's ear when no one even knew he was Kunti's son? And no one would think that he was born out of his adoptive mother's ear. Now, this story of being born from Kunti's ear is found in one place. There is a little summary of the Mahabharata in Bengali, which was few hundred years old when Prabhupada was a child, that says that. And Prabhupada obviously heard that as a child. No Acharya confirmation, any commentary, no Shastra confirmation, but Prabhupada heard it as a child in sort of like, this little book of the Mahabharata. And so he just went with it. Now, Prabhupada is a pure devotee. Prabhupada personally told me that there was never a time when he didn't know Krishna. Prabhupada personally, privately told me that. So, in my view or my conviction, Prabhupada is an eternally liberated soul. However, he was a bit casual about these details. Another example of this is, thousands of ISKCON devotees go to Vrindavan, and there are great, ISKCON storytellers in Vrindavan, and they tell all these stories, and no one ever asks, where does that come from? For example, one time, in other words, this very relaxed, casual.
Can I make could it also be, just going back to the Draupadi story, that although it defies logic in terms of the strictness of Vedic culture in protecting humans, what to speak of women, what to speak of goddess women, could it be, because often we see that for the sake of pastime, to enact the Lord's appearance, that these kind of extraordinary things happen.
But Krishna says the opposite in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says he comes to this world to set a perfect example for others, and he says his devotees should set a perfect example for others. So it's like special pleading. And the reason I mentioned these, famous Vrindavan storytellers, one time I was being shown around Govardhan by a very well-known sannyasi, guru, who had taken many devotees around. And he was saying, here the gopi said this, and here Krishna did that, and every 20 steps there was a new Leela. And at one point I just said, how do we know that's true? What's the source of that? And he was kind of stumped, and he said, and he's shown every senior devotee in the world around Govardhan, and he actually said to me, no one ever asked that. So my conclusion is that within our culture, people are not so demanding or concerned about Leela details. If it sounds good, go with it. If it brings out the right rasa or it makes you love Krishna more, go with it. And that's just the culture. But in philosophy, the people are very strict. And Prabhupada himself taught. You see, I make this point. It's logically impossible. I'll explain what that technical philosophical term means. It's logically impossible to believe that everything Prabhupada said is true. Logically impossible means that if I say here, or I have in my room, I have a square circle. There cannot be such a thing because it's simply a contradiction of words. If you know what the word circle means, you know that a circle can't be square. If you know what the word square means, it can't be a circle. So therefore, the words a square circle are meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. So in that sense, it's logically impossible, because Prabhupada says, I wrote an essay on this, which I can send to all of you, quoting Prabhupada. This is coming from Prabhupada. This is not coming from me. I'm not just, this is coming directly from Prabhupada. Because Prabhupada says many times that I make mistakes on material things, not on spiritual things. It's not the qualification of a pure devotee or an acharya. It's not the qualification to be materially infallible. That is not the qualification. And so Prabhupada, to give an example, Prabhupada uses two different words, the same word in two very different ways. The word opinion. They're two completely different and opposing lists where Prabhupada uses this word. Prabhupada, for example, says that if he was giving a lecture, very typical example, he's giving a lecture, someone in the audience says, well, in your opinion, Prabhupada decapitate him. It is not my opinion. It is not the question of opinion. I've never given my opinion. And yet, in many other cases, Prabhupada said, well, my opinion is, of course, that's just my opinion. So if you look at these two very different lists of cases where Prabhupada uses the word opinion, when Prabhupada insists, I never gave my opinion, he's talking about Shastra. He's repeating or paraphrasing what Krishna has said or what the Bhagavatam says. And therefore, it's not his opinion. When Prabhupada does say, in my opinion, he's talking about material things.
Okay, another point in this regard, those are excellent points. So just like Prabhupada was speaking to the devotees about chastising them for not reading his books, and Prabhupada was saying, I can't remember who he was speaking to.
Just one last, I apologize, but just...
okay, let me have the floor for this.
Go ahead. So I have to explain what I meant about logically impossible.
So Prabhupada said, I read my books. Do you know why I read my books? And everybody was, well, you wrote them. Prabhupada said, no, because Krishna is dictating this to me.
I know. However.
So let me just continue on. So on the premise that that's true, which I accept as an axiomatic truth.
Well, you won't after I tell you a few things.
Okay, well, let me continue, and then you can attempt to defeat this argument. So in the Bhagavatam, in the purports, Prabhupada talks about the Draupadi story. And
I know that. I understand what you're saying.
So if we accept that Krishna is dictating to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada writes it down, how do we resolve?
Well, first of all, because Krishna doesn't dictate everything. I mean, obviously, Krishna inspired Prabhupada. Prabhupada's presentation is brilliant. He has his own meta language. So I am perfectly aware that no one, certainly including myself, has anywhere near the spiritual power that Prabhupada does in his books. I'm trying to build bridges to Prabhupada's books because that's where the supreme potency is. However, I give in my paper quote after quote after quote where Prabhupada says, I wrote these books. These are my books. I have written every word. And so it's always a big mistake in issues like this to take just one thing Prabhupada said and ignore all the other things he said. Because are we to assume that Krishna, just doesn't know English that well? Because Prabhupada's books had to be heavily edited. Why would Krishna dictate to Prabhupada in English as a second language?
Good point.
And so Prabhupada says that Prabhupada didn't, because, and not only that, if it followed that Krishna dictated every word, which is absurd because Prabhupada himself rejects that idea. He says it many, many times. Then it would follow that Prabhupada does not get credit for writing books, a credit which he always took. I mean, not without any material ego, but rather Prabhupada, you see, if it's the case that a pure devotee is simply channeling Krishna, then what it would mean is that the more you advance in Krishna consciousness, the less personal you are, because you actually don't do anything. That when you become a pure devotee, you make one dramatic decision to give yourself body and mind to Krishna, and that's the last free decision you ever make. And so actually in the spiritual world, when it looks like Krishna is talking to the gopis, he's really just talking to himself. Or for example, the Brahma Vimohana Leela, where Krishna takes the place of the calves and cowherd boys, bewildered Brahma, that's the paradigmatic Leela. That all of Krishna's pastimes in this world or through his pure devotees is just different variations on the Brahma Vimohana Leela. So that when you become a pure devotee, that's the last really free decision you ever make. And then you just become sort of like this robotic channeling instrument for Krishna. No, I believe Prabhupada's a real person. I believe his books are full of him. I believe that we can learn about Prabhupada himself by reading his books, and that Krishna himself reciprocates with his pure devotees by giving them tremendous freedom. I mean, all of us, whenever we get it right or whenever we're able to, all of us have had the experience that you're telling someone about Krishna and you think, wow, that was more eloquent than I thought I could do. It's like, we've all had that experience of just kind of being lifted to this level of eloquence and cleverness. And we know it's Krishna, but it doesn't mean it wasn't you. It doesn't mean the spiritual world, no one ever talks to Krishna. Krishna just talks to himself using other people's bodies. So, you'd say, well, Rukmini is kind of very shy and humble, and Satyabhama is the opposite. They're actually, Satyabhama is not very bold, and Rukmini is not shy. Krishna just, did different things through these instruments. No, because in the spiritual world, you have more of a personality than ever. In this world, our so-called personalities are just, the modes of nature acting. The so-called life of the party is just a bundle of gunas.
That's a good name for a song, bundle of gunas.
I'm just a bundle of blues. I'm just a bundle of gunas. We can do that. So my last point, which I didn't get out, and that is that, oh my gosh, what was that point about Draupadi? About Draupadi that, I forgot now. Got the point. But so I take the Bhagavatam. How can it be offensive to believe the Bhagavatam when Lord Chaitanya said it's our main authority, and H.D.Goswami said it's our main authority, and Prabhupada said it's our main authority? the acharyas say the Mahabharata is corrupt. Madhvacharya said it's thoroughly corrupt. Sarvashaha, which means all over the place. He says most of the original verses are lost. So if I take the Bhagavatam over the Mahabharata, it's the same thing I do when I take the real story of Parikshit against the somewhat absurd story in the Mahabharata. So, I know what I was going to say, why it's logically impossible to claim that everything Prabhupada said is true. Because Prabhupada said many times, I make mistakes. It's ludicrous to think that I know all these material things. So when Prabhupada said I make mistakes, not about spiritual things, not about spiritual philosophy, not about Krishna, but if it's true, if Prabhupada says that on non-shastric things, of course I make mistakes. If you believe that's true, that statement is true, but you also believe that Prabhupada never made mistakes, then you're contradicting Prabhupada. So because Prabhupada said I make mistakes on non-shastric matters, then if you believe everything Prabhupada said is true, that must also be true. But if you believe that it's true, as Prabhupada said he makes mistakes, you can't believe that Prabhupada didn't make mistakes. So therefore, take your pick.
So what you're saying essentially is that as you were saying because when you think of the Draupadi pastime, it seems to be in the realm of spiritual, Siddhantic truth. But you're saying there's a difference between that and pastimes.
The acharyas make that distinction. Okay. No one calls pastime details Siddhanta. Okay.
So that's a distinction that I have not made previously.
Well, I know because basically what we're taught in ISKCON, a lot. And by the way, I'm a loyal member of ISKCON. I'm not starting my own.
Your card?
I do. I never leave home without it. And that is that Prabhupada gave us a spiritual science. And I wrote a paper on this, which is being published, by the way, in the ISKCON Communications Journal, which is the latest edition of the ISKCON Communications Journal, published my article on Prabhupada, in which I make all these things, all these claims. So if I have to choose between Prabhupada making a philosophical mistake or just some Leela detail, I'm not going to say that Prabhupada made a mistake in Siddhanta, and yet the epistemic powers, the limits or the powers of the knowledge of a pure devotee, that's a philosophical point. That's not a Leela detail. So what you find many devotees doing in the name of defending Prabhupada is they reject Prabhupada's philosophical statement to defend a Leela detail, when in fact Gaudiya Vaishnava culture is exactly the opposite. You can't meddle with Siddhanta. You can't meddle with philosophical points, but details are just kind of flexible. Sanatana Goswami, even, there's one story, I think, Krishna killing Keshi, and he says, well, that's not what really happened. He's talking about the Bhagavatam, for God's sake. And he says, what really happened is, so the acharyas are kind of, I don't want to say casual, but it's just Leela. First of all, because these pastimes go on eternally in millions of universes, they also go on in the mind of a pure devotee. Krishna can do these things millions of times. So maybe one time he did it this way, maybe one time he did it that way. So I'm just trying to get it right. And the reason I'm doing all this, first of all, for the sheer joy of course, agitating other people, but there's a secondary benefit. And that is that Prabhupada is first, I was very fortunate. More than I deserve, because Prabhupada, the first time he met his guru, he received the instruction which became his life mission. And I had the same experience. I'm not comparing myself to Prabhupada, I'm just, servant. But the point is, the first direct instruction I got from Prabhupada was to stay in the university and to get a very good higher education. That was Prabhupada's, he said, so that I could present Krishna consciousness convincingly to educated people. And that was the first instruction Prabhupada gave me personally in a letter, and it became my life mission. So all I'm doing in my insufferable way, all I'm actually doing He's carrying out Prabhupada's instruction and presenting Krishna consciousness as a logical spiritual science, which, gets some people very unhappy.
But what's fascinating is by having the dialogue, you can lay out the issue threadbare and go through all the subtle ins and outs details, which are cloudy unless you really have that discussion like you just did, because it's subtle.
I agree. I'm happy that you engaged.
I'm actually not. No, I am too, because it's these subtle distinctions are, first of all, it's fascinating, but second of all, it's based on an understanding of the Siddhanta, of the tradition, and of the things that actually Prabhupada said, and and it's I see these points more clearly now.
I'm glad I could help.
Is there a donation box somewhere?
Oh, I'm a walking donation box.
No, but I can see why people get so up in arms about this, because they don't understand your process. You know what I'm saying? They don't take the time, and I'm also guilty of that. And that's why I was asking these questions, because I've had issues about, especially the Draupadi thing. Like, who the hell is this guy? I mean, I'm just joking, but well,
it's a reasonable question. Who the hell is this guy?
it was something that, because I have the greatest respect for you, at the same time, that was a concern of mine. So that's why
But it's natural as a concern. I mean, it was a completely natural concern. And what I'm trying to do, hopefully what I'm trying to do, hope I don't have any really nefarious motives, but I think what I'm trying to do is make at least part of ISKCON into what I thought I was joining. And that is a spiritual science, a movement of philosophers. It's interesting because everyone quotes that verse, Tadvidhi Pranipatena, know that, that the Tattvadarshis will give you knowledge and so on. And what I often say is that, thank you. That one thing you should ask yourself, if you look at the Sanskrit verse, Tadvidhi, it begins with the word that. And so what's the reference for that? Like if I tell you, look at that, what you're going to say, what that? I mean, what are you talking about? If I just come up to you and the first thing I say to you is, that's what you should do. You're going to say, what? What are you talking about? What is that? And you could ask the same question about that Sanskrit verse in the Gita 434. Tadvidhi, that, understand. What that? And so if you look at the previous verse, actually the previous verse and the one after it explain what that is. But that in the previous verse, Krishna says, Shreyan Dravyamaya Jagya Jnana Jagya Parantapa, better than rituals is the cultivation of knowledge for Krishna. And so a simple question, how much money has ISKCON spent in the last 30 years on opulent temples to perform all kinds of elaborate puja and rituals? And how much money has ISKCON spent on high schools for our children, on schools, on a Vaishnav seminaries? We have learned clergy. I mean, follow the money trail if you want to know what the values are. So, I mean, for every dollar spent to save our own children, ISKCON probably spends $1,000 for rituals. By ritual, I don't mean it's empty. I mean, we all love the deities. We all know that Krishna is the deity, Radha and Krishna and so on. But still, Krishna says, Shreyan, better. Shreyan means better. It's actually the comparative degree of Sri. Sri can mean beautiful, fortunate, and all that. And so very Sri is Shreyan. And most Sri is Shrestha. Just a little grammatical thing. So Krishna is Shreyan, better than Dravya Maya Jagya, worshiping Krishna, offering to Krishna with paraphernalia. Dravya.
Substances, yeah.
What's that?
Sorry, substances, right? Dravya.
Yeah, like incense, water, the Arctic. I mean, all the stuff we offer in Arctic, that's all Dravya. So yeah, substances. Incense is Dravya. And, all the whole Arctic thing, the lamp, the water, the little, handkerchief, that's all Dravya. And Krishna says, better than that is to worship me through knowledge, through the cultivation of knowledge. And so nowadays, I've seen in many of the major ISKCON temples, even in the West, that on the important days like Janmashtami or Guru Purnima or stuff like that, they won't have special seminars where they have intensive courses on our philosophy, but there's always the Abhishek, the fire sacrifice, all the rituals come out, but not intensive knowledge. ISKCON is not a movement at this point which is focused on higher education. I mean, we won't even go into what's going on in Mayapur and the name of higher education. But ISKCON, again, where are the schools? They want to build the biggest temple or the biggest dome. Where's the biggest high school? Where are the libraries? I have to say this. I mean, I'm in favor of the TOVP. I'm not anti-TOVP. I have great respect for Ambarish. I think he's a wonderful devotee, and I respect what he's doing. I admire what he's doing.
It was also Prabhupada's such a strong desire.
Yes, it was. But what did Prabhupada? But here are some facts about that. For example, I watched a TOVP promotional video. I mean, they made it, and they were showing they literally have an area. The area, because Prabhupada, the TOVP was all about knowledge. It was to show cosmography and cosmology. And yet, of course, they install these deities, because it's Mayapur, and just the covered space, the constructed space allotted for deity clothes, jewels, and flowers is actually a few football fields. And the space allotted for seminars and lectures on Vedic cosmology is, well, it's bigger than this room. But you're talking about just sort of a medium-sized lecture hall compared to, a few football fields of space for clothes and jewels and flowers. And so Prabhupada wanted to show how the Vedic conception, of the universe is more advanced. And of course, Siddhartha is the great soul that showed that. And we had to fight to even get him into the program. Siddhartha. Yeah, the greatest scientist that ever joined the Hare Krishna movement, by far, actually. And so, a true genius. He was a true genius. So Prabhupada's concern was knowledge. He wanted to show intelligent people, especially Western people, that the Bhagavatam contains advanced knowledge. And it's been a fight all the way to get exhibits, that actually are sound and based on real knowledge. It's been a fight. But I would like to see, because I understand in any religion, I attended a lecture once at Harvard, which really changed my way of thinking. I've said this many, many times. It was in the divinity school, and I wasn't a student in the divinity school. I actually got accepted by 2 different schools at Harvard, but I chose the arts and sciences graduate school because there were less requirements. And I just, the other schools take longer. So, but I attended this lecture at the divinity school, and they had this really interesting professor who was talking about the Christian world. And he just meant like Christians in general, all the different kinds of Christians. And he said there are basically 2 groups. There are basically 2 groups of Christians. One is just sort of faithful. The how do I know? The Bible told me so. The inerrant word of God or some spiritual leader, and that's it. The other group has faith and devotion, but they require a rational, logical, history-based explanation. Like, what does the Shastra actually say? And he said these two groups just don't come together. He said there's no indication these two groups will ever come together. And so whenever you have a large scale religion, you're going to have these two groups of people. And, you know, so when I say what I say, there's a lot of people that think this is like, I'm like the anti-Krishna or something. But in fact, I think the success of this movement, you know, at least for Western people, depends on our ability to present a spiritual science. For example, just give one simple example. What does the Bhagavatam say about the Bhagavatam? What does the Bhagavatam say about how devotees should dress? Because the Bhagavatam talks about it. Yeah, I'll tell you. You know I'm a wise guy. You knew I was going to tell you.
Clean and
No, it says more than that. It for brahmacharis and sannyasis, they're the two main options, and they're both quite attractive. One is original Vedic streaking, in other words, nothing, and the other option is deerskin, as I always say, hopefully with little Velcro so it stays on. But so it's interesting because the Bhagavatam says deer, and there's all these things like brahmacharis, they have a straw belt and all these things, and no one ever does that. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu forbid his followers to follow the Bhagavatam on this point. He forbid his followers because he forbid them to wear deerskin. It's in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and yet the Bhagavatam mandates deerskin. And instead, Prabhupada once said to me in Vrindavan that he said, if you want to understand how to be an ideal Vaishnava sannyasi, he said, you should study the song of the six Goswamis. He said the six Goswamis are the ideal Vaishnava sannyasis, and you study their life. So in that song, it said how they dressed, kopina kantasrito, kopin and rags. So Chaitanya and his followers, Chaitanya rejected the Bhagavatam, deerskin and naked, and then Bhakti Siddhanta and our Prabhupada rejected kopin and rags. So why is everybody changing everything? Because it's a detail. And in chapter 6 of the Nectar of Devotion, Rupa Goswami and Prabhupada say you can and should change details according to time and place, but not basic principles. So if you think a detail is a basic principle, you don't understand the spiritual science.
Can you give the reference in the Nectar of Devotion?
Chapter 6. It's in the first page or two of chapter 6. So, I mean, how can it be that we, more than any other group on earth, preach you're not your body, but you're not your body, but you are your clothes? Or if you're a woman, you kind of are your body. So,
yeah,
I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that.
No, but it's just,
yeah,
it's a paradox.
Yeah. So, the first person who wore plain clothes, the first person just to fit into society, the first person that we have record of that did that is Krishna. Because in the first chapter of the Bhagavatam, it said about Krishna, Kritavan Kila Karmani Saharamena Keshava, that Keshava, the Lord, performed his activities along with Balaram. And those activities were Ati Martyani, literally superhuman. Ati Martyani, Bhagavan Guda Kapita Manusha, he concealed himself, he pretended to be a human being. So however Krishna dressed 5,000 years ago, and the word dhoti is not a Sanskrit word. It's not mentioned anywhere. Or sorry. Whatever Krishna dressed, he was pretending to be a human being. He was concealing. He was fitting in. And Kunti Devi in her prayer says about Krishna that she tells him that Krishna, you appear nato natya dharo jata. It's in the prayers of Kunti, which means you appear like an actor in costume. So whatever Krishna was wearing, and no Shastra says he wore a dhoti. Whatever Krishna was wearing, he was an actor in costume. So I take these verses seriously. We use the word Vedic culture all the time, right? Guess what? It's not in Shastra. There's no Sanskrit that directly translates Vedic culture. Yeah, sorry. It doesn't mean there is no such thing. But so if there is a Vedic culture, it's not an ethnicity. There's no such thing as Vedic dress. There's no such thing as Vedic architecture. Because it's just not there. So what we do have, if you want to say Vedic culture or Vedic civilization, I'll tell you what is super Vedic. Varnashram. The Varnashram system is everywhere in the Vedas. And the idea that the Vedic system culminates, the pinnacle of Vedic culture is love of Krishna. That's right there in the Bhagavad Gita. Vedaischa sarvairaham eva Vedya. So what is Vedic culture in a nutshell? Varnashram, devoted to Krishna. That's Vedic culture. All the ethnic components, a dress style. First of all, people living up in the Arctic Himalayas didn't dress like people did in the tropical jungles of the South for obvious reasons. What's Vedic architecture? What is Vedic cuisine? What is Vedic musical style? There are two reasons, for two good reasons, we actually don't know what music sounded like 5,000 years ago. First of all, because unlike in the West, they didn't write down their compositions. They would it was just kind of impromptu, extemporaneous. They didn't write down their compositions. Number two, for the last 1,000 years, Indian classical music has been totally dominated by Muslims. And the reason is very obvious, because in the pre-industrial world, you don't just make an album and sell it on Amazon. In the pre-industrial world, whether in Europe or in India, the only way you could feed yourself and your family through music or art was if you got royal patronage. Actually, in Europe, there were two options. There was royal patronage or church patronage. But since India didn't have churches like that, so since the Muslims ruled India for about 700 years, and they obviously gave patronage to Muslims. And therefore, there's a remarkable similarity between Vedic music in India and the music of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. I mean, striking resemblance. I wonder why. In Egypt. So for 1,000, and so after 700 years, the classical music scene in India was just so totally dominated by the Muslims. Even when the British came, it just didn't change because you had 700 years of momentum. So because you have 1,000 years of Muslim influence and people didn't write down, in fact, they didn't favor that kind of music. The Concert for George, right? One time, I really like the Western side. One time I listened to the Indian part. And then they had these extra features. So in the Concert for George, there's this one scene where Ravi Shankar is kind of rehearsing the Western band that's going to play with the Indian musicians. And the Western band just can't get something. And you can see Ravi Shankar is becoming kind of like annoyed, like, what's the problem? You just do it like this. And so, but what I saw, from what I know about music, is that what Ravi Shankar didn't understand is that the Western classical approach and the Indian classical approach are very different in some ways. For example, in the Indian approach, it's almost more like modern, like Western jazz, in the sense that you get a basic, chord progression, or you get a basic melody line, and you just improvise. Like you can get a good jazz band, and they'll just take, isn't it, like some simple little line, and they can go all night. And they're actually listening to each other, and or even a good rock band, right? They can do that. That's not Western classical music. I mean, they actually did do that, because if you study what classical music was, let's say like 300 years ago in Europe, or even 400 years ago, they did actually handle them. They would just take a theme or Bach, and they would just go all over the place. But ultimately, they would write down the finished product. And if you're either writing words or writing music, if you write it down and go back and correct it and correct it and correct it, the final product is much more, developed than if you're just like a extemporaneous jazz band or something. And so these classically trained musicians with Ravi Shankar, they were just used to a different style. and they couldn't just jam the way the Indian musicians could, because that's not what they do. And Ravi Shankar didn't understand that. You can see it there. It's on the DVD. So because they did place extemporaneous, impromptu, just, variations above, I mean, they didn't write the music down. We don't have any written music. And so what was Vedic music? What was Vedic architecture? What is Vastu Shastra? What does anyone really know about Vastu Shastra except that it's an old book in Sanskrit? I mean, what evidence we actually have that it's infallible, that it's revealed by God? I mean, what evidence? Whoever said it was. In the case of the Bhagavatam, Lord Chaitanya certified it. He's God. He certified it. We know that Jiva Goswami certified it. Who certified Vastu Shastra?
Would it be on that note? Would it be
Just a question.
Would it be safe to replace Vedic with aesthetically pleasing for all the practical reasons?
But it's not. I mean, India came with some great architecture. I mean, the Kusum Sarovara, I'm sure, is the most beautiful swimming pool on earth. So they have some very impressive architecture that has European influences and indigenous Indian influences, even Muslim influences. But how are you going to convince? I mean, what does it even mean to say that Indian architecture is more beautiful than Western architecture?
I didn't make the argument for that
Right.
reason. I think Vedic can be recognized as something that is aesthetically pleasing all across.
Okay. Yeah. No, I agree. But here's a word. Let me tell you something about the word Vedic. The word Vedic. By the way, English has a massive Sanskrit influence. I could just talk about that all day. There's a massive Sanskrit influence in English. And just one simple example, Jupiter. Jupiter is Sanskrit because Jew is a root from which you get divya, divine, or heaven. And Peter is father, Peter, paternal. So Jupiter means the father of heaven, Jupiter. But anyway, so how is the word Vedic? Because there is a word Vedic in Sanskrit. In fact, we form an adjective from a noun, as in Veda, Vedic, the K sound, because that's what they do in Sanskrit. So you take the word Veda, and to say Vedic in Sanskrit, it's Vaidik. So you do the same thing. You do an IK. So that adding an IK sound to Veda to make Vedic is almost pure Sanskrit, but it's English. So therefore, we can say, how is the word Vedic used, for example, in the Bhagavatam? It's only used in one way, which is very different from the way we use it. In the Bhagavatam, ironically, the word is used in the same way Western scholars use it. In the Bhagavatam, the word Vedic refers to, or Vaidika refers to Shruti, as opposed to Smriti, the original Shruti literature. And it's contrasted in the Bhagavatam with the word Tantrika, Tantra. And here Tantra means, as in the Bhagavatam, like Narada Muni's Narada Pancharatra. The Bhagavatam is a mixture of Vaidika and Tantrika elements. For example, some things which come in the ancient Tantra literature, which is authorized, but not in the Vedas, is deity worship, Vaikunta, the plenary expansions of Krishna, like the Chaturvyuha. None of that is in the Vedas, but they are in the Tantra literature. And therefore, the Bhagavatam says that to understand the truth of God, you have to study both categories of literature. And by Vaidika, Vedic, they mean Shruti, like the four Vedas, or the oldest Upanishads and literature like that. That's how the word's used. The word Vedic is not used in the Bhagavatam to mean the whole civilization.
To switch the subject.
Oh, I got to just complete this.
Okay.
And then in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, how is the word Vedic used? Because the word Vedic appears in the Chaitanya Charitamrita in an even more limited sense. It's used to mean, it only appears in the phrase Vaidika Brahmana, a Vedic Brahmana, which means a karma kanda ritualistic Brahmana. So it's a related usage. Now, it doesn't mean Prabhupada was wrong to say Vedic culture. It's not a mistake in a higher sense. but you have to understand what the word means. Vedic culture doesn't mean certain cooking recipes. It doesn't mean a certain style of architecture. It doesn't mean, wearing robes in a certain way. It doesn't mean putting certain spices and vegetables. It means varnashram devoted to Krishna.
So if in your perfect world, if you had all the money, manpower, resources,
Yeah.
what would be, because going back to the conversation in the dining room
Mhm.
about making ISKCON relevant or making the preaching mission relevant, how to reach the Western population, what would be your main top 3-4 priorities?
We need educated preachers. We need learned preachers who can present Krishna consciousness as what it really is, a spiritual science, not an ethnic tradition.
So to that end, what would you, again, if you had all the resources?
I think we have to. I would build schools. I think we have to start promoting education in ISKCON. It's not enough to build big temples and do very opulent rituals. We actually need schools. We need education. We need seminaries. We should have the best system of high schools in North America. You can build a very big temple, or you can build a great school, and guess which one is going to impress more intelligent Western people?
Really, that's what Prabhupada wanted all his disciples to be Bhakti Shastri great. He wanted people.
But Prabhupada also said at a certain point that we are attracting many people who are not Brahmins or Shudras.
Right.
And he didn't expect people with a Shudra nature to become scholars.
Right. Yeah. And he also said that unless we preach on the colleges and attract the more intelligent people, then gradually we will have no qualified leadership and the whole movement will fall apart.
Yeah. So, but to attract intelligent people, you have to be intelligent.
Exactly.
Which means you have to know our history. You have to know what Shastra says. You have to know, for example, that gender intelligence is not Siddhanta. It's a material science. And Prabhupada claimed not to know all of material science. So, it's all kinds of issues. What we need is an army of learned, rational preachers, faithful, who accept Prabhupada as the founder Acharya, who accept Krishna as the supreme personality of Godhead, and that sort of, all-powerful term that Prabhupada used. And we need faithful devotees, not skeptics, not people that doubt Krishna, not people that doubt that Prabhupada is a pure devotee with pure intentions, not people that doubt the Bhagavad Gita or the Bhagavatam, but people who understand it intelligently. Let's give an example. In the Bhagavatam, there's a statement in a verse that eclipses occur when Rahu chases the sun and the moon. And in the Acharya's commentaries, they say, well, obviously that's not what really happens. In other words, eclipses occur for all the reasons that astronomers give. It's just a story. So the Bhagavatam itself is a sophisticated text. Some of the Bhagavatam, a lot of it, is actual history, like Krishna's coming to this world. Some of it is symbolic, like in the Paranjana story, where Narada says, I just told you an allegory, and here's what the symbolism is. And Narada breaks down all the symbolism. Or, for example, in the 5th canto, Bhuloka, where, the genius Siddhartha figured out that it's actually a completely scientific description of the solar system, the orbits of the planets. And so, there are different categories of statements in the Bhagavatam. Allegories, symbolic, and real history. And real history. And the most advanced descriptions of God and the soul. It's all there. And so if you just take it as one category, then Prabhupada said to me when I was staying with a secretary in 70s, he said, try to figure out the 5th canto. I don't know what it means. Prabhupada said, I just gave a rough translations, to kind of facilitate further research. He said the same thing to Harishori. So Prabhupada said to several of his disciples, try to figure out what the 5th canto means. Prabhupada had no false ego. He had no false pride. He was a pure soul. He didn't claim to know what he didn't know. For example, he wasn't a fact checker. It just wasn't, because all the facts he really cared about were the Bhagavatam statements about God. For example, someone just told him that there's an Aquarian gospel, this ancient Aquarian gospel that talks about Jesus going to India, to Jagannath Puri. And Prabhupada went with it, it's just like, okay, I can use that ammo. But then after a while, someone told Prabhupada, actually, that book was written about 50 years ago by some guy in Europe. And so Prabhupada stopped quoting it. He was just like threw a bunch of spaghetti against the wall to see what would stick. But Prabhupada was very clear that when I'm quoting Shastra, then, that's it. That's the absolute truth. And it has to be a direct quote from a Shastra. And you can say, well, we can't approach Shastra except through Prabhupada, which is true and untrue. And I'll explain, because if you take that in the wrong way, it leads to an absurdity, which I explain in my paper. Because if this is a spiritual science, it has to be a spiritual science for everyone. So imagine an impersonal guru. Imagine an impersonal guru basically gets everything wrong about Bhagavad Gita. But he gives this impersonal commentary on the Gita. And then when you say, well, no, Krishna says right here, I'm the supreme person, then what is that? What do the students say? You cannot approach the Gita directly. You can only approach the Gita through a pure soul. My impersonalist guru is just such a pure soul. And he's telling me that these words are actually meant to be taken symbolically. Now, since you've already endorsed the principle that you cannot approach the Gita except through a pure devotee or just a pure guru, therefore, it comes down to, we just have different forms of faith. You believe in your guru, I believe in my guru. And that's all you can say. Now, I think that's nonsense. I'm not going to go with that. I'm going to say, no, Prabhupada is right, and I prove it by looking at the Sanskrit words of the Gita and what they literally mean. Now, but there's another sense in which we can't approach the Gita or say Shastra except through Prabhupada, but that's a different sense. For example, one of the early scenes of Good Will Hunting, you know that movie?
Great movie.
Yeah, except they use the F word about 108,000 times. And it's just like, I feel like I wanted to tell people, guess what? It's actually possible to complete an English sentence without the F word. It actually is possible. You may not know that. And so there's this math problem that no one can figure out in Good Will Hunting. And then Will, Matt Damon, the early Matt Damon, he's a math genius. He figures it out. But now, so here we have a case. This is exactly the case with Prabhupada and Shastra. No one could figure out the answer until they saw the answer. But once they saw the answer, they could go back to the original math thing and see that it's correct. So they took the answer, verified that it was correct by comparing the answer to the math. So if we approach the Bhagavad Gita without Prabhupada, we'll never understand it. But once Prabhupada explains it, we can, and actually should, go back to the Gita to verify that, yes, actually, every Sanskrit word in the Gita confirms what Prabhupada said. And so therefore, the relationship between disciple and Prabhupada and the Shastra is interactive. One supports the other. And actually in epistemology, in Western philosophy, that's a form of getting reliable knowledge called coherentism. In other words, if you look at Prabhupada and look at Shastra, they're completely coherent. Whereas if you look at Bhagavad Gita and look at an impersonal interpretation, it's completely incoherent. And it relies on a special theory of language, which is not in the Gita itself. For example, someone could say, well, in Sanskrit, it would be parokshavad, which means esoteric. Like it says this, but it really means something else. And then aparokshavad means exoteric. It means what it says. So if you come in with, let's say the impersonalist presents a special theory of language that no, we're not supposed to take this literally, but that special theory of language is not in the Gita, and it's not in the Bhagavatam, and it's not in any other relevant Shastra. Whereas, so therefore, by Occam's razor, the simplest and most direct and explicit interpretation is taking what Krishna actually says as what Krishna actually means. And if you do it that way, then so it's interactive. And just to give one example, there are many verses in the Bhagavatam that make heavy statements about Prabhupada, about women in the English. If you look at the Sanskrits, the statements are not as heavy. So, again, I'm not criticizing Prabhupada. He's a pure devotee. But Prabhupada was doing his best with absolutely pure intention, to save the world. And he saw how degraded the world was. And he came from a culture in which was not degraded in that sense, was degraded in other ways. And so he had no other motive but to help people. But the fact is that often the heaviest statements about women are heavier than the actual Sanskrit. And so, and Prabhupada himself taught us this. Prabhupada says there's Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. I've given all these quotes from Prabhupada. This is Prabhupada speaking. And he says the central authority is Shastra. So I'm just taking Prabhupada seriously. So I have a choice in ISKCON. And that is, I can, accept a mythologized Prabhupada, which, will make you very much loved and, invited everywhere to speak. Or I can accept Prabhupada as he presents himself. I prefer to accept Prabhupada as he presents himself. Otherwise, we're left in this situation, which is really crazy, where we're saying Prabhupada taught us everything. We see everything in this world through Prabhupada's teachings, except one thing. There's one thing we do not see through Prabhupada's teachings, and that's Prabhupada. You should see everything through Prabhupada's teachings except Prabhupada. And when Prabhupada says, I make mistakes on material things, he's just being humble. Who told you he's being humble? Or you're not Prabhupada. And Prabhupada never said that.
There you go.
There you go. So a big problem, I think, and again, I'm a loyal member of ISKCON, and I'm a servant of Prabhupada, a servant of Prabhupada's servants. But the point is that Prabhupada said, if the guru asks for water, don't bring milk. I'm not going to bring Prabhupada theological milk when he asks for water. When Prabhupada describes his powers of knowledge and the limits of those powers, I take him seriously. I take it that Prabhupada's teaching us real philosophy. And actually, in my paper, when I compare what Prabhupada said about his own knowledge, it exactly matches the Shastra. Because even take the Bhagavad Gita. The self-realized souls will teach you knowledge. It doesn't say literally self-realized. It's those who have seen Tattva-darshis. What does that mean? Tattva-darshi means one who has seen the fundamental categories of real things. Tattva is a specific Sanskrit word which means a fundamental category of truth, as opposed to satyam, which just means it's true, it's not a lie. So tattva.
So that means what? Seeing things truly as they are.
It means seeing. There are three fundamental tattvas, which are Vishnu tattva. That's what they're called, Vishnu tattva. The term Vishnu tattva means Vishnu or God as a fundamental category of real things, as an ontological category. Vishnu tattva, Jiva tattva, and Prakriti tattva. So if you confuse these, if you think Krishna has a material body, it's a category mistake. You've confused Vishnu tattva with Prakriti tattva. If you think that you are God, it's a category mistake. You've confused Jiva with Vishnu. Or if you think you are your own body, It's a category mistake. And therefore, when Krishna says you have to learn from the Tattvadarshis, those who understand categorically the truth. So, and that's what the guru's job is. So it's interesting. If you look at the Bhagavatam, it's repeated again and again. Vedanti tat, tatung jad, jnanam, and so on. For example, there's the tattva of Brahman, Paramatma, Vishnu. And so throughout the Bhagavatam, in the first chapter especially, when it's introducing Sutta and what his qualifications are to speak the Bhagavatam, and again it said his qualification is he knows Tattva, which is exactly what Krishna says in the Gita, Tattvadarshi. So it's not the qualification of a pure devotee to be an expert on neurology or gender intelligence. He has no Tattva, or she. And so, interestingly, in Lord Chaitanya's movement, because Sanskrit, like English, over time people use different words. And so in the Bhagavatam, the key word is always tattva. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, they use a synonym of tattva, which is siddhanta, which means the same thing. It means the basic categorical truth. Just like, we use the word sadhana, practice, spiritual practice. In the Gita, Krishna uses a synonym. He uses the word abhyasa yoga yuktena, like, practicing, through the practice of yoga, endowed with yoga, spiritual practice. So the word, when you see the word abhyasa in the Gita, it's our word sadhana. And you see the word siddhanta in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's the Bhagavatam's tattva. I explain all these things actually in my paper.
Can you send me that?
Yeah, sure. And then it's, just go to my, it's listed on my PayPal account. Yes.
I just wanted to share that all these great points you're making from 434, they were all on the 8th grade music test.
8th grade music test?
Yeah. Different categories. Then I showed music categories, but you get the credit.
So I guess getting late. Oh, and there maybe a few people are still actually stayed up for this diatribe.
Let's see who survived.
What's that?
Let's see who survived.
I don't see how leave studio. So I'm going to end here. So everyone's been watching. If anyone is still there, if you, if you could still stand it after all this, then thank you for listening. And I hope I haven't deviated or degraded anyone, but I think that's our philosophy. So Hare Krishna.